This video is sponsored by Objective Control and their new Kickstarter. More about them later on in the video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we are covering measurement and line of sight. Two concepts that seem like they would be incredibly straightforward, but as with many rules in Warhammer 40k, they tend to be more convoluted than, honestly, they probably should be. As always with these deep dive videos, I'm going to be discussing these rules in absolutely excruciating detail, and I'm going to try to keep things as close to the rules as written as possible. Now, especially with this subject material, that doesn't tend to be as clear-cut as maybe we would hope it would be. So I'm basically just going to present to you what the rulebook says. If your local community or the game format that you play in plays things slightly differently, that's totally okay. I'm just here to tell you what the game documentation states. Whether or not that's what you actually do is totally up to you. First off, we'll start with some basic stuff. Distances in 40k are measured in inches, usually using a ruler or a tape measure. When determining distances to and from models that have bases included in their model kit with them, only the base counts, with some exceptions that we'll talk about later. This means that even if a part of a miniature extends over its base, when you're measuring between models, that isn't measured to. Keep in mind that this isn't the case for line of sight, and there's some ambiguity about how models that extend over their bases actually work within the rules. Colloquially, this is known as base measuring because when you're measuring with that model, you measure from its base. For miniatures without bases included in their packaging, you use what is colloquially known as hull measurement. This is actually established within the rules as measuring to the hull and doesn't actually refer to the hull of the model if it were a vehicle, for example, with a hull. That's just an old term from back in the day when vehicles used to measure to the actual hull of the model, which then had to be defined. It was a whole can of worms. Instead, now it just refers to measurement to any part of that model base or the model on top of the base. So when you're measuring to or from a model that uses hull measurement, for example, a vehicle that doesn't have a base included with it, you measure to the entirety of the model. This includes parts like outstretched limbs, guns, antennae, etc. Every part of it is considered when you're measuring in relation to it. Just to confuse you even further, however, most vehicles also automatically use hull measurement even if they have a base included. Any vehicle that does not have the aircraft or walker keyword automatically measures to the closest point on its model, including its base. This is a godsend of a rule, especially for hover tanks, things like wave serpents, devilfish, vipers. A lot of these Xenos vehicles, for example, are hovering slightly off the ground and would be a nightmare to measure to the tiny base that is included to keep them flying. So you are able to measure to their hull even if they have a base included. Aircraft and walkers, however, will always use their base for measurement, meaning that you ignore outstretched parts of the model when measuring to or from them. Keep in mind though, this is vehicles specifically. It does not apply to monsters. Monsters will always use their base, except in the rare cases where they do not have a base. As a bit of an aside, I like to call whatever a model uses for measurement, whether that be its base or its hull, their measurement surface, because that's the surface that you're measuring from. And I might do that in this video. Now, there's a little teeny tiny bit of ambiguity here because the rules for measuring with your model's base, for base measuring models, specifically discuss measuring between two different models. They don't discuss when you measure to non-model game elements, specifically things like objective markers. That said, I think the intention is that the model's base is the gospel for all measurements for models that base measure. That is the case for models that hull measure. And I don't know any play groups or game formats that play things differently. Sponsor time. If you've been with the channel for a while, you might remember me talking about objective control. A clear plastic system for objective zones and area terrain that looks great on the table while not obscuring any mats or terrain that lie underneath. At this past Adepticon, I got a chance to meet the objective control team, and they told me about a new material that they're really exciting to use in future markers. Their new objectives feature an anti-glare polymer, making it easier to see on the tabletop while picking up less harsh light by by diffusing more of it, reflecting less than shinier materials. Now, as a live streamer, this is absolutely huge, and I keep a set of their anti-glare markers with me when I'm streaming at venues that have harsh overhead lighting. Those lights would normally reflect off of the objectives on the table, bounce back into the cameras or even the player's eyes, and just be very distracting the entire time. So they've asked me to let you know about their upcoming Kickstarter, which will feature some huge updates to the objective control range, in addition to their new material options. These include things like thematic options for both Age of Sigmar and 40k themed markers. They also have a new system of push-fit adhesive magnets that have 70 pounds per foot of holding force and are designed specifically to attach to the bottom of miniature bases. This means that you don't have to manually stick neodymium magnets in the bottom of your base and use adhesive putty to hope that they hold in. You can just rip the backing off these adhesive magnets, stick them on your base, and magnetize your models into a movement tray or a carry case with no fuss. New artwork options for these markers will unlock as their new Kickstarter achieves its stretch goals, so don't hesitate to click the link down in the video description and get yourself notified as soon as it launches. Don't forget to check out Objective Control's existing range at objectivectrl.com. Now, in order to determine the distance between two models in the battlefield, you measure the distance between the two closest points of those models' bases. Keep in mind that this is a three-dimensional measurement, so if those two models are on different planes, things can get a little janky. So, for example, if we were going to be measuring the distance between these Demonettes and this Terminator, they would be measured diagonally between the closest points of their bases. A similar thing tends to happen with hull measurement vehicles. You actually measure the closest point between models, which tends to be the diagonal between the model's base and the closest point of the hull measuring vehicle. It's a little bit more dramatic on larger models, but I just have a Rhino for right now. Although I should mention that the rules commentary does allow models to engage vehicles and be considered base to base with them if they are as close as possible with them, essentially overlapping their footprint. Because your engagement range is measured horizontally as well as vertically, you can engage models that are 1 inch away from you horizontally, as long as they're not more than 5 inches up. So you can be 1 inch away from the edge of their model horizontally and still be considered to be engaged. Similarly, you can be basically up overlapping their footprint and be considered to be base to base. Many rules discuss models being within or wholly within a distance or area of each other. A model is wholly within a distance of something if every part of it is inside that distance. So, for example, a model is wholly within 6 inches of another one if all parts of it are within 6 inches. And similarly, a model is wholly within an area if all parts of it are within that area's footprint. This is most commonly determined for terrain, where being wholly within an area terrain element's footprint can grant you some bonuses. It is important to keep in mind, though, that this is a three-dimensional measurement like all measurements in 40k, so if you are measuring to a model that hull measures, for example, or you're measuring between models that are on different levels of terrain, you may need to measure diagonally, which can get a little tough when you're trying to keep a large model or a particularly high model wholly within a particular distance. Fortunately, 40k doesn't use wholly within quite as much as some other games, though. Within, however, is the terminology that this game loves to use. Now, when you're determining which models are within a distance of you, 40k uses what is called inclusive measurement. It means that two elements remain within a certain distance of each other as long as the distance between them is up to and including that total. For example, two models that are 6 inches away are considered to be within 6 inches of each other. They don't need to be inside 5.99 repeating. Now, models in 40k are typically collected into groups called units, and units are collections of their component models, which means that when measuring between units specifically, check the distance between the closest points of the two closest models in the unit. This is rarely relevant. Most of the time, models will be measuring specifically to either enemy units or enemy models each individually. However, there are some abilities like Blood Surge, which I have a whole other video about as well, that will measure the closest distance between two units. Similarly, line of sight can be traced to any model in a unit when you're determining whether that unit is visible. But that doesn't necessarily mean you can attack them, which is a weird distinction we'll talk about later after we discuss some of the basic rules about line of sight and visibility. Now, line of sight is a whole can of worms. And 10th edition's line of sight rules are particularly sticky, mostly because of how they interact with terrain. While the rulebook has some verbiage about getting behind the model and looking from its perspective, the mechanics break down to this, and this is how it's widely played amongst the majority of the community. If you have an unbroken line from your model to another model, your model has visibility to that other model. If you can trace lines to the parts of the target that are facing you, that target is fully visible. If something gets in the way of any of those lines, that target is partially visible. Now, it's important to note that this is also a 3D measurement, so particularly tall models can usually trace their lines of sight over top of intervening elements that would block line of sight for lower models. For example, our Demon Prince friend here is hiding behind this wall, and were I to be an infantry, any line drawn from my infantry model to that Demon Prince would pass through the wall, making him invisible. However, if I was a tall model like this knight, I can clearly see him because I can trace line of sight from the top of my miniature to the top of his miniature, which can follow an angle that would give me very clean line of sight onto him. So in this way, visibility can be measured three-dimensionally, but there are some exceptions, mostly revolving around terrain. Some terrain types, like ruins or forest terrain, are always considered intervening if the line you are trying to trace between the two models would cross over them. Such terrain features are often treated as infinitely tall, opaque boxes that will block line of sight passing through them unless the attacker is wholly within or the defender is within the feature. For some other terrain features, like forests, for example, this can determine if you gain cover from the forest. At this point, it's a common refrain within this video, but I have a whole video about that too you can go check out. Now, the only things that are naturally ignored for line of sight purposes are the members of your own unit, meaning that it's conceivable for other models in your or your opponent's army to block your own line of sight. Although it should be noted that blocking line of sight between models in 40k is extremely hard, since any crack between joints, treads, legs, or weapons can open line of sight back up if there is an unbroken line between the models. Some vehicles are able to do it, and large models like big monsters like Great Unclean Ones, for example, that are huge and physically solid, but for the most part, it is extremely difficult. Now, one of the ways that these concepts that are nominally super simple get very weird is when they're combined together. And that's because our first instinct when drawing line of sight is to also measure our distance between models based on that line of sight. For example, our Demon Prince friend over here trying to draw line of sight to this knight that's not within any of these terrain features would be drawing it to part of the knight that's over in this area, probably somewhere around 16 to 18 inches away. However, distance between models that have bases, in which case both of these do, is automatically traced between the closest points of those models irrespective of visibility, meaning that we're actually 12 inches away despite the portion of the knight that we're drawing line of sight to being significantly farther. For large models that are partially hidden behind the terrain, this can make ranges seem super weird, since short-range weapons can potentially target a model even if the visible parts of that model are farther away than the distance that weapon can shoot. Now, speaking of shooting attacks, it's important also to remember that a model has to trace both line of sight and range to a single enemy model in a target unit in order for them to be an eligible target. This is something I see a lot of people get wrong. I think folks who played in older editions, because I believe that that was not the case prior to 8th edition, but the rules are very clear that an attacking model must both measure line of sight and range to a single model in a target unit. So for example, we have our Demon Prince friend here who's trying to resolve ranged attacks targeting these termagants in this ruin. He has line of sight to the unit, since he can see the 4 termagants that are outside of the ruin and not blocked by any of its walls, and the unit is about 16 inches away. However, he has to trace his range and line of sight to the same model. And since he can't trace line of sight to any of these termagants, he has to measure range to the termagants in the back. And since they are greater than 24 inches away, the range of his weapon, the unit is actually not an eligible target, despite the fact that some of the termagants are significantly closer than the range of his weapon. If he can't see those guys, he can't shoot them, so he can't resolve attacks at all. But here's the kicker. This is not the case for non-attack abilities. Abilities like this are kind of rare, but they do come up occasionally, and a great example is the Brotherhood Librarian's Vortex of Doom from Grey Knights. This ability targets a unit within line of sight, and that is within 18 inches of the Brotherhood Librarian. As we mentioned before, a unit is within line of sight if you can see at least one of its models, and the range between units is measured in the closest distance between their bases. So let's say, for example, we're in exactly the same situation, but this time with a Brotherhood Librarian. He is trying to resolve his Vortex of Doom, targeting these dastardly termagants. He can draw line of sight to any member of the unit, meaning that the unit is visible to him. However, the models he can draw line of sight to are farther than the range of his Vortex of Doom ability. They're 19 inches away. That doesn't matter, however, because we still have some models inside the ruin which are only 12 inches away. This means that the termagant unit is visible to him and within 18 inches, so they are an eligible target for Vortex of Doom, even if he wouldn't be able to attack them with any 18-inch range actual weapons. Unlike attacks, there is no requirement for abilities like this that line of sight and range be drawn to the same model in the target unit. So this Brotherhood Librarian gets to get off scot-free. Now, as I mentioned before, abilities like this are very rare in 40k, but they are a really interesting corner case of 40k's rules. And with that, that's all I have to say for line of sight and range today. Let me know down in the comment section if you have any additional notes about these rules and what you think of some of the weird ambiguities that 40k's rules have. Big thanks to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.